What's up? Welcome to another edition of the Barton and Bud Show. We're excited to be back. We are sitting here fresh off of NFL draft weekends. Maybe even more exciting than ever, considering there's really not much else going on right now. We finally got some substance to chew on over the weekend. It's a huge weekend for us in the recruiting industry. So I hope this show doesn't feel too self-indulgent, but man, it's time to look back and see how we did. Reminisce a little bit about some of these guys. But first, Bud, how's it going, man? How's quarantine life?
It's not too bad, man. Just kind of every day is the same. I put my trash out on the wrong day last week, and I just a day early, and not
better a day early than a day late.
That's true. Yeah. If you do it a day late, you catch some hell for that. No, it was good, man. It was solid. I was just like, oh well, I guess today's a Wednesday and not a Tuesday, but. Draft was great for us. I mean, obviously, we needed some content to talk about at 247Sports, and so that was pretty solid. I was pretty fired up to work a weekend, and it was fun to watch. I was actually kind of into it.
Yeah, I was big on the new the quarantine. I thought actually made for more compelling TV because I thought that was awesome that GMs were making picks with their 6-year-old kid on their lap. I thought it was fun to see these guys. 100 of them, however many they had their videos in their house, around their family, not in some green room with a bunch of suit and ties, but guys just sort of settled in, hunkered down at home with the people that are important to them. All that stuff resonated with me. So I enjoyed the draft as I always do, and we'll talk about it a little bit, but especially this year because it was a good one for us at 24/7. It was a good one for the entire recruiting industry. So we'll dive into all of that. But first, as always, thanks for the reviews on iTunes. Thank you for the ratings. That's important. Give us a 5-star review. Write something in there, anything, as long as you got a 5-star next to it. That helps us continue to find some traction and grow this podcast.
Yeah, man. So we have two we want to shout out here. Thanks to is it Guillaume752? It's GUILLAUME752. First-time listener of Bud, long-time listener and fan of Barton. These guys have great chemistry. I'm a loyal Cover 3 guy. Discovering this pod has been a great way to round out my college football content. Love the thought that has been put into the different segments so far. If only he saw us today. We put about 10 minutes into this, but we just had so much to talk about today. It was just picking and choosing. It was easy. Keep up the great work. So very much appreciate that. Also, shout out Tall Waters for his 5-star. Mentioned similar things. Longtime Cover 3 guy and enjoying Barton and Bud so far.
We're merging the Cover 3 fan base with the Nolecast fan base. It's just like a meeting of two. It's like two parties hanging out at the same bar. All of a sudden, there's a little bit of they converge a little bit, and all of a sudden the party gets even bigger. I like it.
Do you remember in Ninja Turtles 2 when Shredder drinks all the ooze and he just becomes like Super Shredder? I mean, you combine those two audiences, that's just kind of you're bursting through the dock and no looking back. So
strong illusion there.
All right, when we get to 247 5-star reviews, we will do a special listener appreciation mailbag episode. So you can drop some of those questions there in the review section of Apple Podcasts and hit us up with those. And when we get there, we'll drop the show. And so pretty exciting draft for us to talk about here and just so much. We'll see if we can pack it all into this show. But I need to start with a congratulations to you, who you went out. You were bold. You chose more guys than I did as far as your draft locks game that we played. And Barton Simmons comes down and nails, what'd you go, 19 for 19, I think? You had Kelvin Benjamin, you had Patrick Queen, you had Jordan Love as stone cold locks to go in the first round. Let's not pretend that you were at all lacking in confidence about those. And we both got all of ours right, and you were rewarded because you were more bold as the game. That's kind of a limit of the game.
That's right. That Jordan Love was ultimately, I think, what it boiled down to. The Packers taking quarterback in the first round, a heavily scrutinized move, a heavily criticized move from folks that know the Packers' needs a lot better than I did. So fortunate for LaFleur and those boys to go ahead and get that job done, because I was worried about Jordan Love. I was a little bit nervous about him slipping. I know that the draftniks can fall in love with arm talent every once in a while, and maybe his senior year wasn't going to cut it for him. But fortunately for me, he got picked, and that was ultimately the difference.
That was fun. We'll have to do that every year, because it really does kind of make you think a little bit about like how many guys are absolute locks to go in the first round, and it's usually fewer than you think. So, also a pretty good day for the recruiting industry.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, you did a whole story on the industry, and I'm going to get into who won within the industry, but industry wide, I actually go through a process where I actually basically grade every pick in the draft. And with every pick, I determine which site in the industry was most accurate in terms of not highest, but just most accurate, closest to where the guy actually got picked. And if no one in the industry had a 4-star or better grade on a player, I just basically call it an industry miss, because whether you're a high 3-star or low 3-star, you're a 3-star, and for that, I'm not going to reward you for being a little bit better than the others. So, with that as my sort of my guide to this, it was pretty startling to realize, like, and you probably found this in your research too, but within the first 3 rounds. So, and those are basically the no-brainer guys, because you could get to round 4 through 7, and all of a sudden it's really about eye of the beholder. It's about, a guy getting drafted in the 5th round, maybe off the board for half the teams in the league. Like, it's just about needs, personal preference, whatever. Like, those are guys that can be a little bit more substituted for along the way. But the top 100 guys, everyone was pretty much going to pick at some point. And through the top 100, it was pretty startling how many guys were ranked highly. Based on my research, 66% of the top 100 was ranked as a 5 or a 4-star prospect by at least one of the 3 major networks. And you may be saying, well, that's a pretty broad net, congratulations. But I think it's a fair way to look at it, in the sense of at least somebody thought this kid was really good. Like, he wasn't a nobody. He wasn't some anonymous player that slipped through the cracks. Typically, if one guy's a 4 or 5-star, he's usually like a high 3-star for someone else. So most of these guys, better than 65% of them, were acknowledged somewhere along the way by someone as being pretty dang good and probably going to play in the NFL. And so I think, in terms of just the macro perspective of sort of recruiting rankings, that's a pretty good representation of the industry starting to hit this pretty well.
So there are typically 350 4 and 5 stars combined, right? If you out there think that you can go and predict the 2025 draft, the top 100, given 350 chances right now, or come February, I'll take that bet. Straight up odds, and if I get enough of y'all, I can go ahead and retire from 247 Sports, because that is really so much tougher to do than anybody thinks, right? And folks out there are like, oh, you guys just follow the offers and blah, blah, blah. And look, you'd be a moron not to actually use the data that is offers, right? Like, why would we ignore that? If you're working on Wall Street and, so a very respected venture capital firm invests in a startup, you're not going to be like, oh, no, I'm going to keep my opinion the exact same on that guy as what it used to be. Some additional stats I found here. So 4 and 5 stars make up only about 7% of D1 signees, right? So that's FBS scholarship guys, obviously, and then the few FCS scholarships that are out there, they obviously have a lot fewer. They were 66% of the first round. So your first rounders, 66% of them came from a pool of players that we have identified as just 7%. I mean, that's pretty nuts. The vast majority of your players out there are going to be your unrated kids who actually sign scholarships, 2 stars and 3 stars. I mean, that's 37% of kids are 3 stars, 35% are 2 stars, 21% are unrated but actual scholarship signees. Just 7% are 4 and 5 stars. So it is really tough to do that. And I've tracked this for I mean, gosh, almost a decade now, well before I worked for any of these recruiting services. And I think this is the best draft that we've ever had as a recruiting industry overall. For that reason, but also the highest average star rating ever of the first round at 3.75, which is a good bit higher than it's ever been. The previous high was 3.65, so we went up like a full tenth, which is really impressive. And then also, I don't necessarily consider a 3-star a miss quite like you do. I mean, I understand the logic behind it, and we want to improve it, right? We want to have every kid who goes in the first round at least be a 4 or 5-star. But there's some like the numbers wise, that's really hard. What really bothers me is if we throw a 2-star or an unrated on a kid who shows first round potential. And I'm like, why did we miss, on that guy? This year, only one player in the first round was an unrated kid or a 2-star. And that was Brandon Ayuk, who had no offers because he had no grades, right? Which is why he had to go to junior college. And then we correctly rated him, or, well, maybe incorrectly, but we actually put a rating on him once he went to junior college. So highest average star rating ever for the first round. And then also the fewest number by far of 2-star or unrated players in the first round. To me, that's a pretty big win.
Yeah. I think it's, because I think it ultimately you have to, yes, I mean, it feels good from an industry standpoint to be able to throw that in the face of the folks that say stars don't matter or whatever. But I also think it's representative of just the information available in the space, whether that be film, testing numbers, track and field data, like all this stuff is just so accessible now. And look, the reality is schools are doing a better job of finding these guys as well. I think the better the recruiting industry is doing, that means the better the sort of FBS Power 5 type of programs are doing and producing these guys, because the Tristan Wirfs of the world are going to Iowa. They're not going to Northern Iowa. And part of that is because and I'm not saying Iowa. I mean, Iowa typically finds those guys, but so maybe he's not the best example. But a Brandon Ayuk is going to Arizona State out of junior college instead of Northern Arizona. And so I think that it's just getting, and I'm anxious to dig in and find out, which of these programs really are doing the best job of evaluating beyond just taking the 5s and the 4-stars, because that's the next evolution is not only, are you taking players beyond the 4 or 5-star range, but when you take them, what do they become? I think it's so interesting to look at the examples of players like, this past class, Jackson Smith-Njigba was recruited by Ohio State and ended up as the number 2 receiver in the country. So that's going to ultimately, I expect him to play in the NFL, and ultimately Ohio State's going to look good for that. But people are going to point at Ohio State and be like, look, Ohio State, of course he's going to the NFL. They took the number 2 receiver in the country. They can just out-recruit people. But the nuance there is that Ohio State identified Jackson Smith-Njigba when he was a 3-star, and I think prioritized him in that way. And then as he rose in the ranks and as more eyes got on him, his stock rose. I think a similar case could be made for the evaluation that Notre Dame did in Kyle Hamilton, a future first-round draft pick. Kyle Hamilton was a 3-star and had good junior film, but Notre Dame made him a priority, knowing that look at this long-bodied kid, look at the way his frame could fill out, look at the way he moves with those long limbs. Let's see what he becomes. And then the senior film is just like ridiculous, off the chart stuff. And at that point, he was already a Notre Dame guy. And so I think that's sort of the next step, because we're getting it right, but we have the benefit of time to get these kids right by February. Colleges don't have that benefit. Colleges have to get it right when they offer them, when they take the commitments. And then if their stock dips or rises, that's on them. They got to either take the kid or cut them loose. And so it's really interesting to see how these teams are going to navigate that sort of thing and who does a good job when you really get in the weeds of it that way.
So let's get into this as well. Obviously, your article today, your scorecard for the industry, 247 Sports was the winner. For those who haven't read it yet, exactly how did we do it? And I use we, kind of liberally here because I wasn't on the team back in 2016, 2017 when these ratings were being assessed to these high school recruits. But how did 247 Sports separate from the rest of the industry and get the dub?
So first of all, and again, just to reiterate, the way this was graded out, basically it was a scoring system that gave, you get points for having the close, most accurate ranking. And then, least accurate ranking, obviously you get the points diminish from there. And so every player was graded, and if no one had them ranked to 4 or better, you sort of pass on them. So I think there's about 117 or something players had a grade from at least somebody. And again, there were 70 of the top 107 had a grade by at least someone. So that was, things dipped in the later rounds. But I gave bonus points for having a top 32 guy ranked in the top 32 go in the first round, and I gave penalties to a guy that was ranked outside the 4-star range who others had as a 4-star. And I think for us, like where we really hit, and this is something that is, I'll give you a few examples of our big wins. So I think in the first round, a big win that we had was the quarterbacks. One, it was Joe Burrow, having him as the highest ranked inside the top 247. And that was even, we didn't even really get a chance to see him. And I would argue maybe if we were ranking today, we would even rank him even higher because we have further prioritized efficiency, production, and been less concerned about sort of what the raw talent looks like. Like, what are you doing on the field is the most important thing. We kind of took that a little bit from Cliff Kingsbury. That's been a big emphasis of Cliff Kingsbury when he's evaluated the quarterback position, and that's been something that has really proven to be a good indicator. Burrow was off the charts in terms of that stuff. We just didn't have the confidence to go higher than we did because we hadn't had a lot of exposure to him. So Burrow was a win. Tua Tagovailoa was a win. I remember thinking back, making Tua a 5-star kid. We caught a lot of heat for that, particularly because Jake Fromm wasn't a 5-star. And Tua was small at the time. And at that point, Kyler Murray hadn't been drafted yet. And being 6-foot-ish isn't ideal. But Tua had these big hands. He was had these incredible intangibles, and he was awesome at the Army All-American Bowl. And so, we bet on that. And I think, frankly, the more you can dig into leadership and intangibles at the quarterback position, the better, because we see busts every year, and a big part of that is just how committed are those players, because it takes incredible commitment at the quarterback position. And then the other one that I think speaks to from the first round, that speaks to sort of our direction in terms of how we look at guys is Austin Jackson. Now, this was the first round that saw a lot of big-bodied offensive tackles get drafted, but Austin Jackson very much fits into the prototype. This is the USC offensive tackle, as a guy that was young for his class. He was very long, basketball player, 3-sport athlete, 50-plus foot shot putter. So you have all these contributing athletic verifiers that you sort of have a better sense of who he is. And frankly, like, his career wasn't necessarily always a no doubt 5-star career, but even this draft is like a projection on who we think he's going to be. And so that ultimately hit, and we were sort of rewarded for taking that gamble on a guy that wasn't a polished product. So, I mean, those are the first round guys that we, I think, really won with. There's more that's I think speak like we started. I think that was the year in that 2015, 2016 area where we really started to try to like find these guys and go against the grain if we needed to. Dalton Keane was one we hit as a 4-star, played quarterback, tested really well, played outside linebacker, tight end, like everywhere for his high school. That's the versatility that you need to have at the tight end position. Leki Fotu, 1 year playing football, was all-state, played rugby before that, was 255 pounds, goes to Utah, red shirts, gets drafted as a 330-pounder. Like, those are the type of trends now that we really want to have the expertise to dig into. And I think this is the first class that we really bought into, really selling out for those sort of trends. Quintez Cephas, 5th-round draft pick, 1 year playing football in high school, but his basketball clips were off the chart. If you're not watching his basketball clips, you would never necessarily think he's a first-round or an NFL draft pick, but that stuff matters. And so I think that was, in terms of our hits, that was where we started to get some wins this cycle.
So it's interesting to me here, and this is not on our outline, but we talk about projection, and there's certainly a different amount of projection needed at different positions, right? We talk about projecting less at quarterback because, and I think the reason why we're able to do that now is because the offenses run in high school and college, the gap in terms of scheme is not quite what it used to be. You know, it used to be like, even 15 years ago, you got all these teams running wing T out there. It's like, all right, can this guy go play? And like now, no, man, everybody runs a spread. Almost all of these kids play 7-on-7. So we don't need to project quite as much. And luckily for us, we're able to rely more on the data. If you're a 55% passer in high school, it's going to be a tough argument for me to put a 4-star grade on that kid, unless the team around him is just absolutely horrid. You know, that's interesting to me. Whereas tackle is a position that still involves a whole lot of physical projection, and you better, because sometimes the kids who are already 330 are maxed out. And if it is our goal, which it is here at 24/7, to project these kids from high school all the way through the league, because the league and the draft is how we are viewing our rankings, right? Like that, the league is sort of our check and balance here. We need to project significant upside with that tackle position. You know, we might do it a little bit differently if we were only concerned about college production. If we were only concerned about college production, I'd probably be in our rankings meeting standing on the table for some of these guys who have a little bit higher floor, but certainly a lot lower ceiling.
Well, and this is like I try to take the opportunity every chance I get to make sure that we hammer home what our philosophy is, and in that sense, like I actually could kind of care less what these guys do in the NFL. But I'm obsessed with where they're going to get drafted.
Right.
Because to me, where they're going to get drafted is ultimately the real only measurable metric of what their college career was. Like the only actual objective way of actually grading out how someone's college career fared. Yes, there are other ways. You could go turn to production. You could turn to just like all conference awards or something like that. But I think those fall short of what we're trying to accomplish in rankings, which is evaluate for talent and ability. And in terms of, and that's all the NFL is looking at, talent and ability based on what you did in college. Like how talented and capable do we think you are based on what you put on tape and what we know about you as a prospect. And so we use NFL GMs, NFL scouting departments as the means to find a grade for those rankings. And so I think you make a great point, and I think it extends. It's even interesting to see it extend now into, like this is what, the third straight year we've had a Heisman Trophy winner be drafted number 1 overall. Do you remember back when the Heisman Trophy was like a total kiss of death for NFL success? Like it was just a given. If you win the Heisman, you're going to be a bust, because what you need to do in college to be successful at the quarterback position is different from what you do in the NFL to be successful at the quarterback position. I think. You're like no longer do you have to have a translator for what a good quarterback looks like in high school versus college versus the NFL. Because look, I'll be honest with you, I don't watch a lot of NFL not because I don't want to, but because purely I don't have the time to watch all football day on Sunday, given the work we have to do plus Saturday and Friday obligations we have watching football as well. So if I was an NFL, if I was trying to project a college kid to the NFL, and I had to sort of find a translator to tell me, well, does this work in an NFL system? I don't know. Like this is that's gone. That's like antiquated. Now all of a sudden, NFL is being forced to accommodate these more spread style quarterbacks, and the spread is sort of trickled, I guess, up from high school to college and out of the NFL. And now they're just picking the best player. And it's refreshing because you don't have to act like it's some, like you don't have to be bilingual in terms of how you view these quarterbacks. It's just, hey, if he can be the best player on the field in high school, if he can be the best player on the field in college, he can probably be the best player on the field in the NFL too.
And that has changed so recently. I remember I wrote a piece on, like, could Jared Goff be the first air raid quarterback to not be like a total bust? And all the Elite 11 guys were like, man, Jared Goff's got the goods. And I still don't know if he does. Like, it seems like McVay has to read the defense for him and call his play and all that stuff Belichick did to him that all the other teams started to copy where they shift late once the headset clicks off. But the point is, like, Jared Goff's not a bust, right? Like, he may not be amazing, but now these air raid guys they're accepted. And, like, it's okay because these teams are incorporating more and more concepts, like you said. Now, after our ad break here, I want to get into what I've found over about a decade of looking at the rankings of when we miss as an industry, what are the most common buckets that these kids that we missed on fall into?
You're probably wondering how a sports podcast can talk about sports with no live sports. Well, Nothing Personal with David Sampson is more than just your ordinary sports podcast. I'm David Sampson, and I spent 18 years as a president in Major League Baseball. And on this show, you'll hear the truth about what's happening behind the scenes in the world of sports. We're even going to talk entertainment with you. We are a part of the CBS Sports Podcast Network, so Nothing Personal is available on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever else podcasts are found. And as we all do our part and continue to stay home and help flatten the curve, remember, I'm here for you, but it's just business. It's nothing personal.
The world of golf is on hiatus, but thankfully for you, the First Cut podcast crew is not. Join Mark Immelman, Kyle Porter, Greg Ducharme, and myself, Rick Gaiman, as we keep you informed and entertained through this unprecedented time. No tournament? No problem. We're still coming at you 3 times a week during these trying times. Tune in as we bring you weekly news, rewatches, interviews, and trivia. What are you waiting for? Come join our group and let's talk golf. Download and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and anywhere else podcasts are found.
All right, Barton, we're back. And so now I want to go over some categories that I typically find when we miss on a kid. It's usually not just a bad evaluation of the kid's skills. Occasionally it is. I'm not saying we're immune to that, but typically there are some categories that these misses fall into. And I want to talk about, like, are these misses, knowing these categories, can we get better over time as an industry at ranking these players when we kind of think about in our head, all right, are there anything here that we should probably do differently because of this? So I'm going to go down these, and maybe we can kind of think of an example or two from prior years. And I know just in my head, just some of the ones you were reading out are ones that we actually probably already accounted for with some of our wins. But the first to me would be academic issues. A lot of colleges, if they won't touch a kid because he's a academic risk, he's definitely going to go to junior college. Then he may get no offers, and it's not often that we put ratings on a kid who, by the end of the process, still has no offers. So Brandon Ayuk would be the prime example here. He was the only unrated player in round 1. Another kid who actually did get an offer late would be Justin Jefferson, right? Because he finally got his stuff in order, but he didn't get his stuff in order until well after the rankings were finalized, correct? Like, he didn't get
after signing day. Yeah. It was the summer before it was like August before the season when he got eligible.
His offers were Northwestern State and Tulane. And I'm guessing if you can't get into LSU, you probably can't get into Tulane. So I kind of question whether he actually could have gotten into Tulane. So we'd basically be looking at Justin Jefferson as a kid who has Northwestern State, right, as his lone offer. And then he gets the grades or whatever, or was it a test score? I forgot what it was. And he ultimately is able to get into LSU. Academics are one. Like, do you think we should reconsider how we evaluate kids who don't have grades?
So Justin Jefferson is a great test case to sort of dig into so people understand, because when I explained Justin Jefferson as he had a low rating because he was was considered to be a likely academic casualty, people are like, well, that's just lazy. You should have just ranked him in high school. I get that. And yes, I do think that the correct answer there is yes, we should. If a kid is that good, he should have a 4-star grade, probably, though outside the top 247, because his sort of value as a prospect is not as high as others who are confident will get in. That said, from our perspective, we're trying to rank 4,000 plus kids. if there's a kid who you think is likely going to junior college or almost a lock to go to junior college, it's just not a guy that we prioritize to spend a lot of time evaluating because there's so many other kids to dig into. And so you just sort of set him aside and say, you know what, like we're going to deal with him when he gets to junior college. And that's sort of what happened with Justin Jefferson, because we certainly knew who his brothers were who played at LSU. We knew he was productive, but it wasn't ever really, no one ever really made a point to watch his film and to give him a full evaluation because everyone assumed it was just going to be a junior college guy we would evaluate in a couple of years. So, I think the answer is we do need to make sure those guys have a fair and proper grade, but realistically, a lot of those guys are still going to slip through the cracks based on just purely, us not having the attention span and the bandwidth to deal with every grade risk in the country. Like a Corey Davis, for example, who went to Western Michigan, who was a high grade risk. There's a reason no one ever paid much attention to him because he wouldn't get any offers because no one thought he was going to get into school. And then Western Michigan gets him in late, and sure, ideally we get an evaluation on him and get a really high grade on him, but in practice, that's a tough thing to accomplish.
Absolutely. And of course, that's not the only reason why Brandon Ayuk was unrated. We have some other reasons as well, which we'll get to later. So my second one here that I've discovered over the years is football was not the player's primary sport throughout the majority of his high school career, right? So a lot of examples of this, Josh Allen, the defensive end the Jaguars took, who I'll probably use several times in this because he checks almost every bucket. He was mostly a basketball kid for a lot of his career. And Quintez Cephas, who I know you brought up as well, would fit here, right? He played football for 1 year. He was primarily a hoops guy.
Yeah, Quintez Cephas and Lecky Fotu both were, really jumped on the scene their senior year, and so those are the type of players that it takes senior due diligence to dig up, because otherwise, it's so tempting to just move on to the next class. But I think to find these guys, you have to really dig into senior season. So we've actually, like, even this cycle in our recruiting, we actually were a little behind on getting the class of 2021 and 22 rankings out because we spent so much time in the fall digging into the class of 2020 and making sure we didn't miss anybody. And so I think that's the way you have to do it. And I think from a college end, that's the way you have to do it. I think if you are filling up your class to accommodate yourself for the December signing period and you don't do any work on senior seasons, I think you're doing yourself a disservice as evaluators, because so many of these guys come onto the scene late and have their big seasons as seniors. Absolutely.
There's no doubt about it. And I think the temptation to move on is greater than ever with the onset of the early signing period. Additional factors here as far as football not being primary sport. If we think the kid is going to go pro in another sport, sometimes like that could be a consideration. If the dude's like a lock to be a first round baseball pick or a first round NHL pick, well, if he plays another sport, the chance we're going to get him right and him being in the NFL draft is pretty low, right? Most dudes are not going to go first round in the NFL draft if he's actively playing another sport. Not that it never happens, but certainly it's a consideration. We also see that those guys who play other sports oftentimes have, not guys who play other sports, but guys whose football is not their primary sport. Sometimes they have potential that was not evident to us, especially watching their football tape, like you mentioned with Cephas. But even sometimes if they're playing another sport, we later find out, damn, like their best sport's actually football. And we might have seen this a little bit earlier, like when they were in high school, if they had played a little bit more football. Not that we're anti-multi-sport guys, because I think we all love the multi-sport guys for sure, because the versatility and the other athletic abilities that it helps unlock for you. But there's a lot of factors there when you have a guy playing multiple sports, although we definitely prefer that you do. The next one I have is...
And just to dig in on that a little bit too. So, yes, I agree. Like, multi-sport we actually love multi-sport and like the multi-sport athletes, but the point is sometimes they're a little bit harder to identify. Like last year, a really big chunk of the tight ends drafted last year were walk-ons. I can't remember the number. It was maybe like 3 or 4 of those guys were walk-ons. Or maybe it's something like, the last 4 years, there's been at least one walk-on draft to the tight end in the first 5 picks or something. Like Cahill Waring, who was the San Diego State kid. Like he played like basketball, like volleyball, water polo, just everything. He was a walk-on, played football, I think his senior season. And then, so many traits or skill sets are involved in playing the tight end position that then like he can pull on all of those and develop at so much more rapid of a rate. So it's hard to dig that guy out in the front end, but on the back end, he's a guy that is really valuable. I think in this 2021 recruiting class, Jake Ratzlaf is a really interesting name. But we talked about this kid in our rankings meetings here recently. We ranked Jordan Adams a 5-star coming out of the 20, I guess that was 19 maybe class. He went on to get drafted in the first round of the Major League Baseball draft, and he is, he's probably never going to play football again because he's that good in baseball. Jake Ratzlaf is an interesting one in that we think he's a really good player out of Minnesota in football as a linebacker and as a 4-star level kid, probably a pretty highly rated 4-star kid in our eyes, but he may never see a college football field because he's probably going to get drafted in the first few rounds of the NHL draft. So that's a place where we're trying to guard against getting tripped up by a guy like that. But the reality is someone may not view him as a high value prospect from a ranking standpoint because of the NHL thing. And then, he decides to play and all of a sudden he could be a 1st-round pick.
Yeah, just a little behind the scenes here. We had our rankings call, I think 2 weeks ago, and all of us kind of sat around and we're like, hey, look, if it's baseball, we know the perfect game guys, right? Like we know who we could go over there and ask, like, how good is this guy in baseball really? And they can generally give you a pretty good range. Like this kid tells me he's going to be a 1st-round pick, and the baseball scouts we know tell us not so much, right? Like he might be a 3rd or 4th round pick. He's pretty good, but he's not likely to be a number 1 type pick. In hockey, we were like, anybody know any hockey scouts? Like how good is this kid really going to be? Because, we just don't cross into the hockey realm that much, but somewhat because of when the sports are played. But I think there's a little crossover here from hockey to this next category, and that is if you are a player from a foreign country. So there's all kinds of questions about the level of competition you face. We oftentimes lack the ability to see you, especially see you in person. I don't know if Luke's going to approve our expense reports to go over to Europe all that frequently to see kids. But
I got to sneak over there last spring. It was pretty awesome. But even over there, Notre Dame side, this kid Alexander Rinsberger, who I got to get over to Amsterdam and see him in person, and he looked unbelievable, but he didn't even work out. And his film is playing against a bunch of nobodies, and like he looks like $1 million. He could be drafted in the 1st round, but ultimately there was really no way for us to know who he was, what he looks like. So yeah, I'd love to get over there every year. Let's keep it rolling.
So the next one here is if you were a full year younger than your peers, right? So Daniel Jones is my most recent example of this. Daniel Jones was, I think, 18 months younger than his peers. I don't think he turned 18 until right before he enrolled at Duke. So if you are that much younger than the average, and I usually just use like December 31st as the average birth date or whatever on that. But if you're that much younger than your peers, it can sometimes be difficult to project just how much extra growth and potential you actually have compared to the other guys in your class. And this is something I actually do believe we could do better as an industry. I know some of the guys who scout baseball, and they always refer to these kids by their age first, right? They're like, he'll be, and they use some kind of like agreed upon date, like, okay, it's August 21st or whatever. He'll be such and such age on this, by this date. So everybody in their mind, they have kind of like a universal standard for how old the kid is. It's like his baseball age. That's something I think we could probably do a better job of internally and saying, hey, this kid who's really young, he might actually, maybe he could be a 94 instead of a 93 just because we have to account for the potential that he continues to blow up.
Yeah, and we've tried to incorporate that a little bit in our recent discussions too. And yet at the same time, I think even in your backyard, there's some great examples of guys where you need to be careful not to be take your eye off the ball, because Calvin Ridley, I think, is one that was like 19 years old as a senior, first-round pick. Kelvin Benjamin, he may have been 20 as a senior. I don't know. He was old.
Yeah,
he was
had
a first-round pick. So, those guys can still hit too. I think if as much as anything, it's more about like Kelvin Benjamin it wasn't like, oh, there's no more growth potential with Kelvin Benjamin. That's a red flag. It's like, no, he was already a freakish specimen. Right. So like, what do we care that there's no more growth potential? Or Calvin Ridley, like, how much better is he going to get? Well, it doesn't matter. He's already like as polished as we've seen coming out of high school. So who cares if he's old? Whereas, maybe it should be a concern if you see the 215-pound 6'1" quarterback that looks like he's had, been drinking a six-pack on Saturdays for the last 5 years, and he's 19 years old, and it's like, all right, this guy's starting to look a little fratty, and like, how much should we expect him to continue to develop in high school? I think it's a lot of it's positionally and about making sure you're understanding like where the body type and projection needs to come and how important it needs to be.
Absolutely. So my next one here, and this is one that realistically we try to account for, but if we were to project guys to do this, we would probably all lose our jobs. And that is guys who gain at least 15% of their body weight in college and keep the same level of quickness. And so I looked at this just on the 2019 draft. Chris Lindstrom, Garrett Bradbury, Noah Fant, Darnell Savage, Andre Dillard, Titus Howard. Titus Howard went from 225 to 322 and became an offensive tackle instead of a quarterback, which is, pretty good growth in college there. Marquis Brown went from 130 to 168, so almost 30% body weight increase there, while still obviously keeping his great speed. And an LJ Collier as well. This is by far the most popular category. When a guy exceeds his rating by a whole lot, and we miss on him because we put a unrated or a 2-star grade on him, if I had to bet on just one category, it's this overwhelmingly. It's guys who got so much bigger in college. And we try to evaluate frame, but yet, 15% growth while keeping your athleticism is like 270 to 315. That's not easy.
Yeah, we've definitely tried to be more open to that, and particularly at offensive line. Chris Lindstrom is an example of a guy like that one. Looking back, I can see a scenario where I can say, you know what, we should have identified him because the film is awesome. And in fact, if you look at the way we ranked the 2020 class, Nate Anderson's heading to Oklahoma and was sort of our Chris Lindstrom prototype. We ranked him really high, really early. He was a 250-pound guy early on. He moved over from defensive line to offensive line as a junior. That was his first year playing offense. And he's like, when he goes to an All-American game, he gets overwhelmed a little bit by these big guys. But we saw Chris Lindstrom film. We saw Nate Anderson's film. We were like, you know what? Like there's a lot of similarities there. We should rank this kid high, expect him to blow up. And Oklahoma ends up taking him, and we'll see what happens there. But so there is absolutely an effort by us to now see a 260-pound offensive lineman, 270-pound offensive lineman, and our eyes perk up rather than us get discouraged that he's not big enough. Because I think that's a flawed way of looking at it. But to your point, there's some guys we're just never in a million years going to predict. We're just not going to predict that average tight end Garrett Bradbury turns into the best center in college football.
What about receiver Josh Allen, who went from 205 to 262 and switched positions?
There, exactly. That's not going to happen. We're not going to predict that Titus Howard, a high school quarterback, is going to go and in year two move to tight end and then move to offensive tackle and be a first rounder out of Alabama A&M or wherever he was, Alabama State. So there's some that we're just going to take L's on, and there's impossible to take a wizard to figure it out. But that's the idea is to hold ourselves to a standard that sort of forces us to try to find the guys that we actually have a shot with.
Absolutely. So a couple more here. Injury. So if a player has limited film, this is something we run into in a couple of these categories, right? Like limited film that we can actually evaluate. One of the reasons why he might have limited film and thus sort of delayed development is if he was hurt a lot in high school, right? Like Khalil Mack was a miss by the recruiting industry because they did not pay enough attention, I don't think, to what he did as a senior. But Khalil Mack, early on in his high school career, was hurt a whole lot. He didn't have a good junior year or forget which year it was, but like he didn't play very much, right? There's a lot of guys.
Yeah, he didn't. I think he didn't play. I think junior year was his first year playing football, and then he got hurt. And so ultimately, senior year was the only year of football he had on his resume.
Darnell Savage as well, the player from Maryland, fits in this category from the prior draft. I know he broke his femur early in his junior year, so he only ended up, like, first of all, he lost that kind of year of development, and then he played some as a senior. Where'd he go? Maryland, I think it was. But like that's another example of that. And just a lot of these kind of cross over into, for whatever reason, we're not able to get enough film on the kid, or not able to account for, like, does this kid have more potential than we realize because he missed this time of development? And can he recapture that, right? There's no guarantee that he can recapture that lost time. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
Well, look, I did a story for CBS about sort of why, because like you mentioned, there weren't a lot of 2-stars and undrafted that were expected to get picked. And so I was doing a story on sort of what happened with the 3-stars, like how do we miss on some of those guys? And Justin Herbert is one example. And Oregon fans were in my Twitter mentions being like, oh, whatever, y'all are just lazy. If he had committed Alabama, you'd have made it out there to see him, whatever. Okay, take your shots. But the reality is Justin Herbert fits into the category you're just talking about. He was actually injured as a junior. Really, senior season was the only real season of that we had to go off of. He doesn't even get the Oregon offer until mid-October. And yes, that is how we found out about him. We didn't know about him until the Oregon offer, because his other offers were Montana State and Portland State before that. And you know what? Like, we are ultimately still a media company. We don't cover Montana State and Portland State. And so the kid from Eugene with the only offer from Oregon pops up, and yeah, we didn't send a jet out there to go see him, and so that's on us. But he was ranked as a high 3-star. We the film looked good. We certainly saw some tools, but sometimes you just got to sort of take your lumps and understand, like, it's going to be. We could have taken a projection there, but that means someone else that we know more about probably has to go to the 3-star range, and that's a tough string to pull.
Absolutely. So next one here is it's also kind of related to getting enough film on the kid and having a consistent sample to evaluate. If the kid transfers multiple times in high school, this can create issues for the recruiting industry, because you may have a different guy who is evaluating him in one region, and then another guy who doesn't necessarily know about him evaluating him in another region. And there's so many transfers and kids move all over the country. It's not realistic to expect a team of like 8 people to constantly shoot notes to each other. Hey, this kid who I have yet to put a grade on transferred out your way, right? So let's use Josh Allen as an example, the defensive end who went to Jacksonville. And I use him just because there were so many good examples of all these boxes he checked. He's in New Jersey as a freshman, okay? He's playing receiver, and I think basketball primarily. He might have played a little receiver. So he would have been Brian Doan's kid. Then he goes down, moves to Alabama to live with, I think, his aunt or his grandma, and then doesn't play as a sophomore, right? Because he's playing hoops. Then he plays, I think, as a junior, plays receiver in Alabama in a town of only 3,000 people, which we'll get to in a minute, and then transfers back up to Jersey and plays a couple games of defensive end where a scout or a high school coach who is related to one of the coaches or one of the analysts, I think it was, at the University of Kentucky was like, hey, this kid we just played, he was playing defensive end. He tore us up because he was an opposing coach. He told his brother who was on Kentucky's staff. Like, and like, if you move around a whole lot as a player, you may not have anybody to go to bat for you. Like, this was an opposing coach who recommended Josh Allen, not his own coach. You may not have anybody to go to bat for you. You also, like, a lot of times putting up the film is on these high school coaches. And I'm going to clue you in on this something if you're a high school prospect listening to us. If you transfer out of a high school coach's program, you may not be at the top of his priority list as far as getting his film put up. So that can cause issues. That's not an excuse. That's an area we can probably try to dig on more, but just practically, if you transfer multiple times in high school, that is something I've noticed over the years, that it does increase your chance, I think, of being missed on slightly.
For sure. Josh Allen's a great example, because Josh Allen had a great senior year. Like, if you just look purely at his senior season, like, there's no excuse for him to have been missed, but you're exactly right. Like, the reason he was missed as a senior is because no one really realized he was up there. And
Right.
it would have taken some due diligence to figure that out.
New to the sport of football, we already went over that kind of with Quintez Cephas. But if you haven't played football for that long, it's difficult for us to project exactly how much potential you might have because we don't really have a great baseline for where your game is currently at. Remote or tiny high school classification, or if you play 8-man, right? So Leighton Vander Esch is obviously one of the prime examples of this. He played 8-man football. We don't really evaluate a whole lot of 8-man football. It's just not. It's played kind of in like the American West and some in the Midwest for these very small towns. I do see this pop up as a trend sometimes. If your town has less than 3,000 people, or if your high school's enrollment is less than 500, it does seem like you have a little bit higher chance of being missed on. And that's probably just, honestly, a resource thing. You know, it's impossible to stop by all these high schools. You're going to try to play the efficiency game if you're an evaluator or if you're a college coach, right? Like, they're going to go to the high school that's more likely to have somebody. It's a numbers game. If you go to a high school with only 500 players, or not players, excuse me, but only 500 students, the chance that a player is there who can help you is rather low. It's not the most efficient use of your time. It also, and you can speak to this as well, like trying to evaluate film of some of these like 1B rural classifications. Like there's still some high school teams that you and I can go out there and probably play on. And I don't think we're anywhere near our playing shape, right? But like, I mean, some of these teams are just, you got 25 guys on the team and most of the teams playing both ways. And it is hard to evaluate, but I do see that sometimes. And we've seen that with Daniel Jones. TJ Hawkinson was a good example of that. Darnell Savage was a good example of that. Josh Jacobs, actually, I think was a pretty good example. Or I DM'd with you last year. Remember for that article, it's like, how did we miss Josh Jacobs? And the only real category he fit was that his high school had like 400 enrollment or something like that.
So I think this is really interesting too, because I've talked to personnel directors about this, because it's something that is curious to me in terms of time allocation, resources, whatever, like whether it's worth it. Because as we were going through the draft, looking at the draft, as things were coming off the board, we were texting with some guys in our network, talking about how all the Cali kids coming off the board weren't LA kids. And so when you're thinking about, like, let's say you are, I don't know who you are, Utah or Texas or something, and you want to say recruit California. I've got quotation marks up. And so what's the most effective way to do that? Well, you're going to go fly into LA and you're just going to hit 10 schools a day rolling through LA. And that's great. You're going to get a lot of California exposure. You're going to see a lot of guys, and maybe you can steal someone. But if the players that are getting drafted are from Bakersfield and Inland Empire and like all these a little bit off the beaten path sort of places where you can't just jump off the flight and hit a few schools and then get back on your airplane, but you have to actually sort of dig into to find these players, then what does it really mean to be recruiting nationally? Like, I wonder, teams that say are sort of recruiting Georgia in quotation marks, like, does that really just mean you're recruiting Atlanta? And I'm not even knocking it as a strategy, because maybe it's just not worth it to go try to like get down to Columbus, Georgia, or get down to Valdosta. Maybe Valdosta is a different story, but like, it's just the net benefit of taking the time to get to these rural areas. Is it really worth it? There's a kid in the 2020 class, Jalen Conyers, who we actually sort of tried to address in this category because he was from the middle of nowhere. Groover, Texas, I think is where he's from. And it's basically like a 6-hour drive from anything. And you're driving that 6 hours just to see him. And then you're driving 6 hours back. And so that's a day basically on a valuable recruiting time that a coach would have to spend to go evaluate him and recruit him. And so is that worth it? It probably isn't for a lot of coaches, and which is why a lot of these schools or a lot of these kids might find their way to a smaller program and then go kind of under the radar and get drafted high.
Absolutely. And I think there are areas like that in every state, right? Like even in my state, I'll talk to some of these college personnel guys and like, hey, why didn't you list my guy as far as like your top recruiters for this area? I'm like, well, coach, because your guy flies into Tampa, goes down to IMG, probably goes back up to Hard Rock, and then flies home. He doesn't actually make the drive all the way down to like Naples, Fort Myers, and it's there are areas in every state, and I think there are some states that are almost entire states, right? To where, like, we were talking the other day, like, we're going to find a 4 or 5 star from North Dakota one day. Now, it may not be this year, but like eventually we will get one. But that's something we have to be conscious of. And even if we identify the kid, like, it's so important to get him to a camp, which it's likely to be tougher for him to drive to a camp if he lives in the middle of nowhere, because the quality of competition when you're watching his film, like, I know there's kids out there that we watch and you're like, man, this is really good. And we had it on the call the other day. You're like, hey, is anybody, what kind of competition is this kid playing? It looks like he's playing a bunch of middle schoolers. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a private school by my house. Like, he actually is kind of playing a bunch of really, lackluster competition there. And then the final one we have is position change in college, right? So this is something that it sounds like a cop-out on its face because all kinds of guys change positions, but I'm talking about major position changes, okay? So not necessarily going from receiver to tight end, but like if you go QB to defensive line, right? Or receiver to defensive end or something like that, right? Corner to linebacker. Those are position changes that are, they almost always correspond with you being one of those people who grew a lot more than we could have reasonably projected you to grow. But it's also not something that we frequently do. Like, we'll have our defensive back meetings and we'll say, okay, is this safety? Could he turn into a linebacker? We very rarely say, could this corner turn into a linebacker?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I think that goes back to just like what's predictable and what's not. Like, we can't, like, there's this, I mean, you can't predict that. Like, yeah, that guy's not a very good corner. Well, he could be a great linebacker. Well, yeah. He ain't going to be a linebacker, and then he's a linebacker. So that's yeah. I mean, that takes the wizard I was talking about.
So those are the main categories that I usually ID each year. It's clear we can, we already do try to incorporate some of these. Maybe we can try to incorporate some a little more. And there's some, it's just, we'll take the L because, like, the opposite. If you tried to incorporate it and you started projecting like a crazy person, you'd take a much bigger L and you wouldn't have the top-rated recruiting service out there among the media outlets. So I wanted to touch on one thing here. I know we're kind of running a little bit long, but Shea Dixon of our LSU site had a pretty interesting catch.
So Shea, like, everyone's talking about all the freaks on LSU's roster, and rightly so. LSU's been recruiting at the top of college football. But Shea sort of hit on something I think is really compelling and brings up a few other talking points too, in the sense of since 2012, I don't have the tweet in front of me or the story in front of me, but since 2012, every recruit that was the last offer in LSU's class and the lowest ranked kid in LSU's class, so typically those guys have been the same person. I believe it's every one of those guys has gotten drafted. And I think that's fascinating for a few reasons. One, it brings up the idea that, if a program like LSU is taking a kid that's really low rated, and that typically correlates to some really, like, a really poor offer list as well, like just a guy that doesn't have a lot of attention and national appreciation, they usually know something. Like, there's something that they know, whether it was typically it means they worked him out in camp and they sort of fell in love with him in that camp workout. I talked to Jeremy Pruitt for an interview that we'll have out in a couple weeks about him offering DeAndre Baker, and when he was at Georgia. And DeAndre Baker had bad film as a junior, but he worked him out in camp, and he fell in love with him in that camp workout. And he acknowledged the film wasn't good as a junior, but the film improved as a senior, and then that was enough. And so, like, those sort of guys, I think, there's that sort of confidence from getting hands-on experience with them, and B, I think there is an element of, I mean, it sounds cliche, but I think there is legitimately an element of, like, these guys come in and know nothing's going to be handed to them. They know they're walking in with a group of 5 stars and 4 stars, and they're the low man on the totem pole. They got to work their tail off. And so I think there's a chip on their shoulder sort of element to it. And then finally, I think, like, there is a real, like, you have to, if you are LSU and you're taking, say, a 2-star kid, for an extreme example, there's like, the environment around you of stars and ratings, you can say, look at that stuff, listen to that stuff, but it's still, you're taking a kid that no one else knows anything about. You have to have added conviction on a kid like that. And I just think that that's really interesting that those guys have had such a high hit rate at a program like LSU. And it certainly also speaks to their development as well.
There's no doubt about it. And I also think now with the transfer portal, there might be some strategy to this, right? Like there is some selection bias, like you said. They probably knew something. But now if you're a college program, you're already likely to be holding out more spots for potential transfers. You may only take 23 instead of 25 guys on signing day just because you want to hold a spot or two open for a potential transfer. Maybe that fits into this strategy as well, right? Like if you're monitoring the academics of a kid late, like a Justin Jefferson, or I'll give you a kid who I remember from the class of 2019, right? Howard Allen, who was an offensive tackle out of Jacksonville, and he didn't qualify. His Twitter profile says he's in Liberty, Missouri right now, so whatever JUCO is there, maybe he's playing at that JUCO. He was actually a kid we threw an 87 grade on, right? Like physically, he was off the charts. He just was not going to qualify at all. But like teams were watching him just to see if he'd pull some kind of miracle down the stretch there, and he could have been another late offer type guy. Do you think we'll see more of this as a strategy because teams are already holding offers open for transfer portal guys?
I think you may. I also think there is. I think you can, because like I said earlier about sort of evaluating senior stuff. So many schools. Ohio State's practically done with their 2021 class. They're getting rolling on 2022 right now. Like can Michigan State or Michigan or somebody, find some senior riser while everyone else is filled up, or Kentucky? Can they, I think that there's an opportunity for schools that can really navigate senior seasons effectively. And that's ultimately like what those late offers come boil down to too. Like if you're getting a late offer from LSU, if you're the last guy offered, I tell you one thing it definitely means is that you had a great senior season. And it probably means you didn't have whatever happened before that was low profile. And so I think there's an element of like identifying these guys as seniors and being able to hold out spots for these late risers.
There's no doubt about it. I think that's something we'll definitely continue to monitor. But like our rankings pretty much lock well before these guys ever get greenlit to commit. So maybe it's something that we do in the final week of a sweep of like, hey, is there anybody out there? Just ask the schools that you're like, well, you're seriously hoping gets qualified that we don't know about already. I don't know how we adjust to that as an industry, because we do lock our rankings when we do, and then some of these guys aren't getting greenlit to go ahead and commit until June, July, August. Yeah,
I think the other thing that I've got some ideas too for that we can talk. I should
talk about off air.
Probably shouldn't brainstorm on the pod, but I've got some ideas for some ways to keep us disciplined too, and like making sure that we dig out some of these group of five guys as well. It's fun. Like this is to me, that's the most fun part about the rankings. It's not, to me, it's really less rewarding to sift through the 5-star rankings. It's more rewarding to identify that James Morgan, who goes to Bowling Green, should have been is going to play in the NFL, and then he gets beat out at Bowling Green and then transfers to FIU and then has a mediocre career and gets drafted. That is a win. Like that is one that I can feel good about and say, you know what? All right. Like we were right. The traits were there. Let's see somebody coach them up.
No doubt. We are at the hour mark, so probably want to, I don't think we want to jump into the whole Dylan Brooks and Landon Jackson discussion, right?
Yeah, we can save our Tennessee love for another day.
Hell, man, it might just be better. They keep getting a new guy.
That's right. One more to talk about.
Yeah. So that'll do it for the Barton and Bud Show. Please make sure you give us those 5-star reviews on iTunes. We're available, like I said, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts. Show us the love and tell your friends if you're enjoying it, and we'll keep them coming.
world of golf is on hiatus, but thankfully for you, the First Cut podcast crew is not. Join Mark Immelman, Kyle Porter, Greg Ducharme, and myself, Rick Gaiman, as we keep you informed and entertained through this unprecedented time. No tournament? No problem. We're still coming at you 3 times a week during these trying times. Tune in as we bring you weekly news, rewatches, interviews, and trivia. What are you waiting for? Come join our group and let's talk golf. Download and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and anywhere else podcasts are found.